It's just one of these issues that I'm reluctant to even discuss because it's so annoying, which is to be someone from the West that was not colonized by the Soviet Union per se with military occupation and cultural occupation, such as the form that the Ukrainians got and Eastern Europeans got, but a neo-Leninist, an insidious neo-Leninist cultural occupation, which is the subversive side of Russian imperialism. And the subversive side of Russian imperialism that has taken over the academy in the West, they did the long march through the institutions starting in the 60s. This is just known at this point by anyone in the cultural fields, unless they're imposters, neo-Leninist imposters that claim that their cultural substitution that's taken place is in fact the legitimate Western culture, which is based on what colonial narrative, anti-colonial narratives. Isn't that hilarious? The same imperialist brain blasters that the Soviet Union had probably in the same department had two radically different versions of culture. The culture they were going to spread in the West to undermine it, and the oppressive Soviet official Homo Sovieticus cultural program that they would have in their country and in their closest of colonies. So what I really find annoying is when you have Ukrainian academicians that became imposters in the West. Like they took on the impostorous Western culture, the neo-Leninist, leftist, divisive, subversive, bottom of the pyramid at the top of the pyramid at the bottom type of cultural inversion, and also atomization, I might add. Like that's just a different form of it. Right, it's not the form that's focused on authority, it's the form that's focused on destruction. Because once the place falls apart, because all the groups are fighting against each other, which is really understandable, and no cultural institution would ever, that was legitimate, ever take these narratives upon themselves in a natural setting. And so the most annoying thing is when you do get these academics, because it's really a global, at some point, the neo-Leninism becomes global, right? Because that's coming from the West. It's been transplanted in there and is flourishing there to the detriment of Western culture. Certainly, U.S. culture. U.S. cultures, at least amongst the cultural institutions, is unrecognizable compared to what it was in the 80s and 90s. Just unrecognizable. It's completely changed out. You could say it was like the difference between probably South African universities in the 70s versus today. The buildings might be the same, but there's nothing that remains of what was South African culture after their political institutions got taken over by a one-party system, by the way. Or let's just say a communist party. As far as I know, they haven't lost an election since becoming the Democratic first choice, in most likely a rigged election, or one that was carried out under all different types of false pretenses and promises and every other kind of propagandistic baloney that was also a pet project of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. But if you have dishonest academicians or ignorant ones that think they're really smart, that are really well informed, and yet don't know anything about those gigantic issues, and yet they think other people are ignorant. They're the ass backwards, ignorant ignoramuses that again are pushing a substitute culture, which is grotesque in the extreme. Just imagine, just on the face of it, let's have a university, but because of politics, we're going to make sure that 90% of the positions go to people for ideological reasons. Just imagine that. Don't even have to know what type of ideology it is. What type of university is that? Well, the short answer is it's a defunct one. It's culturally illegitimate. It's a new form of colonization, right? Ideological colonization. And so they have their little weasel words and also their little weasel fields of study that have no business being at a university. Yeah, because they're so important, because these people have been so oppressed for so long, they get to dominate the 90% of the cultural institutions. And you have to be a card-carrying leftist in order to stay there. These people with their little stinky books and their little closed venues and their little hate campaigns, they're the ones that Ukrainians want to have to host because they fought for that type of freedom. What? Like these peoples are dense. These academicians, but why? See, it's hard to call them really stupid and ignorant. You could either say they're maniacal or they've been programmed to see it this way, right? Or they're engaging in doublethink. Like, this gig benefits me. I live a Western lifestyle off of Western institutional money, and so I understand this is what I just have to say and do, like a little reverse Soviet. And then I've got my tenure, and then I can just profess to be the different brand of the same thing. Just think of all the obnoxious art these people have foisted off on the world, and to the exclusion of the real thing. And yet they're so beyond reproach that you can't tell them that without being put into some basket. They can just per se dismiss you and then claim that we're so much more modern than the people 300 years ago. Oh, really? Let me tell you, 300 years ago, cultural people were not being blasted with this idiocy of groupism, identityism, and also vanity, like really splitting up groups saying, oh no, we actually were superior, we were oppressed. Oh really? Is that right? Is that the way you see it? When you take the top spots and create a monopoly, because that's thinking in the past, this person doesn't have the right credentials because it's not modern, because it's gone on. This is decades old at this point. Yet then you've got fresh-faced Ukrainians with the new programming coming back teaching Ukrainians what modern is, when in fact it's nothing but imposterism, cultural imposterism. And will have the same type of effects in Ukraine that it did in the Western world. Go to Spanish universities in the UK. universities in the US, universities in Canada, all the departments. Look at the, you could just put what the crap that they are hyper focused on. It's just mind boggling, the cultural vandalism that is going on. And then look at the demographics. Got what? No spots, no support for the culturally active classes, or you would think would be culturally active, but they're not. It's like, oh well, yeah, we've become modern. That we don't have any recognizable people that aren't on the leftist loony bus. We're gonna go now exactly double down on identity politics, but to the exclusion of normal identities. And then we're gonna play the cultural card. It's just such a waste of time. I just the thought of all of these literary rags, they're just filled to the gills with just time wasting rubbish. And to think that would be some type of cultural achievement to then have that in Ukraine after a massive war like this, it's just, I mean, you could just forget about human society. Really, you could just forget about the way humanity works. You could forget all about this. Put old bald Lenin and his subversionist and cultural imperialist program behind you. Wherever you've got society at work, you're going to have these retrograde movements and actors and shakedowns and blackmails. And it's it's really important not to focus on these people, these types of people. It's really important not to focus on it. If you see them, you just have to look away. And it's funny because they like to put in their spiel, and 90% in, then they drop their bombs. Right, so don't feel bad about that. Just scratch them off the list. Just to make sure you know, oh, okay, that person, that institution that has that person as their spokesman, that place is cooked. Place is not worthy of further review. And it's a shame. It really is. It's like, okay, yeah, here's this wonderful recipe for goulash, but at the end throw in the 3 cyanide pills. You can leave that part out, that's fine. They insist on adding them. Insist on pushing their agenda through all institutions in the West. How about this? This would be one of the most disgusting and perverted and grotesque ironies ever, is if their subversionist cultural narrative prevails then finally in their prison state, so that the despotic core finally gets infiltrated and putrefied by the idiotic culture that is extant in the Western world at this time. Let's hope that doesn't happen. That would be, it wouldn't be an irony that's even close to funny. That would be just horrifying. Just the stupidest, worst outcome. That's what it would be. Not that they have anything really worth studying there now. I'm hoping there's some people that are bunkered down, cloistered themselves away. And I suppose that'll happen just like it's always happened during barbaric times. People cloister themselves away and use what's left of the institutions. How about all the Greek texts got burnt down in Alexandria? Isn't it a shame they're no longer with us? Maybe we would know a few more things than we do today, such as how the security of Alexandria fell to the point that it did, that it's now unrecognizable as a city of culture today. Wouldn't that be quite useful to know, to avoid those things from happening? So yeah, people getting blown up by bombs. Odessa got hit by an airstrike the other day. The Kerch Bridge got hit. This is retaliation here. People are dying left and right, and yet these cultural lunatics do not skip a beat. They see nothing wrong with what they're doing. They're very in on it. They profit by it. They propagate it, and they stick to the dogma. No matter how many bombs fall, they're gonna push the anti-imperialist narrative of the Soviet Union. Because of course that's the correct lens to see things through. Oh no, we're not. It's not that version. We've updated it. We've made it more congruent, and then reattached it to all these other hate-filled movements that we celebrate as some kind of advancement in civilization, when it's the exact opposite. So that is my statement for today. Let's hope at some point they develop a Patriot missile system for all these cultural bombs that are being thrown around here. All the anarchists in the academies that have their conservative dogma of doom and destruction and division and hate, that they clear the universities out from all of that, and all of their associated and irregular and affiliated members that propagate the same dogmas. Perhaps a big storm will come, and then all the little locusts get washed away. Be a wonderful thing it would be a wonderful miracle, wouldn't it? It can happen, why not? So I understand it's difficult. Like, you have to jump over the Soviet propaganda, the official kind, and you have to jump over the artificial kind that they propagated in the West. I understand it's a two-step process. You think, oh, I just did one, that's enough. No, you have to get over both of them to be considered legitimate. And if you don't, then you're done. You should just realize that in real cultural circles, you're an orangutan. You're worse than orangutan. You like to point at stupid Russians and their stupid what they don't know, because they just watch TV and it's not very informative and their brains are malfunctioning. You're the equivalent of that from the Western side. So just realize that you're not above anybody in the West if you adopt their narrative for the West. The anti-colonial narrative is just something that Lenin picked up. He saw it was something that could be turned into some type of flame war between different people that would be irreconciled forever, right? Part of the class struggle, oppress or oppress. Feeds also into the Freudian psychology, which is also a fraud. So there's a lot of mutually reinforcing positions that they have, and all of them are illegitimate. So don't think your fancy doctor's diploma or whatever is going to be able to give you a qualification that you cannot achieve via the means that they've given to you. So keep that in mind, yeah. Ukrainian cultural warriors, right? You might rediscover the Ukrainian, but make sure you don't add crap to the soup that doesn't belong there. Because it's happened. UK has those people. They consider themselves, they're from the United Kingdom. They're the experts, right? No, they're not. They're synthetic replacements to the opportunity cost of culture. They've taken away the positions and spots of legitimate cultural actors. So just imagine that you're joining the new criminal collective, the new international of criminals, cultural criminals. And you might start off small, because of course you want to say the right things to the right people that are the wrong people, by the way. Signal, because that's how you play the game. But actually, you're just not even an orangutan. You're worse than an orangutan. You should never even learn to read and write. You should just, who knows what, just picked apples or cleaned out chicken coops. Would have been a lot better for you and everyone else. But no, because you're such an ambitious person, you busted your way into these institutions, and now there you are, roosting, laying eggs and clucking, which is really a sign of decline. It's not a sign of advancement. But I understand that people that are delusional, they really do think that they're bringing everything to the world that the world hasn't received yet, but the world's still waiting on the excellent culture. And yet, what it seems to have is a bunch of over-esteemed bureaucrats that are politically connected and also politically degraded. So do try to keep the two distinct, culture and neo-Leninism, because really the two don't mix at all. So no, not your 90% with your 10% on top. That just is the equivalent of a hot diaper. That's what it is. So do keep that in mind. Perhaps some of you can facilitate a change towards authentic culture, which might also mean taking a backseat to it. That is hard for hardcore egotists and people who are unbelievably vain, that they don't catch that part, but it really is necessary. These pick-me's and I want the spotlight because I got here by getting a bunch of gold stars from a bunch of other bureaucrats. That's the only way you can really classify them as. But are they really teachers? Are they really insightful? Or are they just really impenetrable people that just got put on this road for whatever reason and stuck with it despite not having any aptitude for it, other than the political intrigue part, which should have never been a part of the process in the first place. So, yeah, that's it for today. Do keep that in mind, as this is nothing more annoying than a cultural imposter. Because there's an organization behind it. That's what Leninism is. See, Lenin was a person consumed by hate and ill will. Now, he had his own reasons for it. But when has finding reasons for hate and ill will ever been a skillful practice? Well, it never has been and never will be. But he perfected it to an art, and he wasn't just a revolutionary, he systemized his theories, which means he was able to scale them and adapt them to other countries and cultures. And in fact, that was a big part of his plan. He was like, all right, well, Copernicus revolutionized astronomy. I'm going to revolutionize politics. That was his sort of thinking. That was the context in which he thought. System totality on an international scale. So you could see how talk like that could attract intellectuals, and it did. It sucked them in to become part of the Jehovah Witnesses of disgruntledness in all societies everywhere. So what does that mean? That means, yeah, people down on their luck, people on the fringes, people that don't have nothing but want something, and can be very easily told a set of lies that makes them more disgruntled and more empowered to take those things that the other people that have things manage to get using illegitimate means. They enslaved my peoples, right? That's one of them. They took this ancestral land away from our forefathers. That's another one. The whole anti-colonial thing is one of them. Then it was the men, these big, selfish men, that get the women on board that think like that. Where, what could that be? That could be 80% of them at any given moment, depending on the economy. Or whether or not their hairdo is in fashion, or whether they're big boned, or you can find these women, they're fanatical. Just waiting to hear somebody say that, give them credibility for their asinine and hateful theories about life. They have a whole program for them. Oh yes, we hear you, sister. Sit down. Oh, we're going to all talk about this right now. We're going to find some man from history that was horrible. We're going to apex a fallacy our way to the next world revolution. So they got them on board. This is what they understand to be community organizing, because they're organizing for power politics, which is to say a political takeover. Take over the politics, take over the society, take over the culture, take over the economy, take over the military. Sort of like that. Do. However far they can expand the franchise with whatever disgruntled skunks that they can drum up at any given moment in time. Now, of course, not all of the people who are oppressed in other cultures and societies, not all of them are completely without reason. If you look at countries like Nicaragua, it was really the rulers that wanted to have some type of feudal system there, who were decadent, out to lunch, and not caring enough for their workers, treating people like human beings, sharing the equity a little bit, which is more or less just good management. If you're not paying your workers enough and they're starving, that's bad management. I don't care where you're from. You could be Chinese, you could be Pakistani, you could be an American. You're doing that, right? But it happens, just because I say that doesn't mean that the world's going to change. That's happening all over the place. That's happening in cities, in countries. That's happening in countries. It's happening all over the world. So their form of political Jehovah Witnessism has appeal everywhere. You just have to have the right organizers. They get the little pamphlets and they get the little franchise. This is how you do it, and you just appeal to these points, you build up your base, and then you are the one, if you can filter it to a cult of personality, you're the leader, the infallible leader that is the just arbiter of all of these grievances. And then, okay, as payback for the skunks that get you into a lifelong political dictatorship, they get jobs, right, in the toxic blob. They're the toxic blob. They got lifelong jobs too, as long as they don't mess up politically, which means insulting other betters, or causing a nuisance, or being anything other than a conformist. And just take their money and their position and their prestige, which is all ill-gotten, by the way, and don't discount the orthodoxy in any way. And whatever the orthodoxy comes up with, you're just a renamob to clap for it and to cheerlead for it anywhere else in the world. So if they're pulling a con job in Cuba, well, you're on board to support that. Pulling a con job in South Africa, you're on board to support that. You got con jobbers in China, you're on board to support that. Because you get a piece of that, because they check your credentials too. Because they're in on it. They did the same franchise. The Leninist franchise, they got the same franchise. It's like Mickey D's of politics. So, and their takeover also has a cultural component. That means all of their crappy literature that they produce under these regimes, that is just a substitute for the real thing. It's horrifying for a cultural person to think about the cost, the cultural cost that these people truly represent in the form of an atrophied culture that can lead to exterminationism. I mean, is Cuba the same Cuba after Castro just ran it into the ground? Is it the same country? No, it's not. It's just a piece of geography that got run into the ground for political reasons. And political reasons or personal reasons of the people that decided to pick up the political franchise. So as horrifying as that reality is, and again, it's so easy to discount Lenin, because what an ugly person in such an ugly time, that and such ugly propaganda that he produced to then put a spin on the franchise, which makes it so hard to see just what's the final bottom line. But once you see it, right there you realize, on the one hand, how prevalent it is. Depending on the country you're in, you could do a gauge. You open a newspaper, how many terms do you see? Is it 5% poison, 10%, 20%, 100%? That's a pretty good barometer for how much potential that country has or not. And yet again, you could think, all right, well, you've got a toxic blob then and a supreme leader, so what can you do with those? Depends on what you want them to do for you, but gotta imagine it's probably most likely going to be some type of criminal enterprise. So it does speak to criminals. They use criminals, they understand criminals, they recruit from criminals. Many of them are criminals, ex-cons, just straight out, just like Lenin himself, straight up ex-con. They think that's cool, that gives you revolutionary cred. So again, we come back to the bourgeois, but established people, people who have worked their way up through the ranks, those are the class enemies because they discredit or won't buy into their Jehovah Witnessism, which is the bottom, the dispossessed, the rooked are right, just like them. So you can see how what mass appeal that has for certain people. For people at the bottom, it's like, wow, you're inverting reality for me. This is inversion reality propaganda. I get it. I'm on board with this. I get a little uniform and a gun and a badge. As long as you guys aren't all dead, I'll be working for this cause. You can see how people would be on board with that. Well, they were on board with that. That's how they got on board with that. But to think that that's making a comeback now in Europe, that they've already put their new left rat poison, they've injected it in all these diffused and not necessarily interrelated areas to create certain subversive sub-narratives that feed in to their Jehovah Witnessism of politics, takeover of the countries that they infect. And think of infection, it's a weakening. Your body's distracted. It's fighting off this, it's fighting off that. The more they can inject, the more they can engage in replacementism and cultural degradation. Oh, this factory was working great till the company got taken over. Now they produce crappy quality and they've jacked the prices. Nobody can understand it, but global players can that don't care about that product. Actually, they care that it doesn't get better. It's not working. So they got a whole different set of like world international principles that nobody could plausibly or reasonably expect to be as relevant as they are. So, but again, to come back to the good news is they're identifiable. They might have been rocket scientists in 1917, but now the Empire Strikes Back. I mean, this is a sequel to a movie that's been analyzed to death. So that this time around, they think they're going to pull a fast one. I think they don't realize that they have less surprise this time because they did get a good shot at running countries in Central Europe and they completely fail. Because that wasn't their purpose, was it? It was just sort of a raiding party, an occupying force of people in on it and people out on it. And the people out on it, they were fair game for the people in on it. Real simple and pragmatic like that. So the one that does the 10 jumping jacks, that's the one that gets to go back to their rationed existence. The one that does only 9 jumping jacks, that's a counter-revolutionary, a bourgeois throwback, a class enemy, someone, again, a shop foreman that worked his way up to become an owner of a company. That person wouldn't agree to our terms. That person is bad. That person's a traitor to the cause, a class enemy. See how they could just redefine everybody into that box, us and them? So yeah, lowest of the low type people, that's what it appeals to, and psychopaths and opportunists. So again, those are all factors that are pretty easily identifiable. And of course, sellouts, you're going to find those as well. People say, oh, well, I made my bed, I can't. They took over, so I decided I'll just roll over too. There's no force in the world keeping someone in a situation like that except complicity or ignorance or delusion or what else? Just think you could find a reason. They do. So, yeah, you could think of it as a late stage syphilis that took hold in Russia after World War II. No, World War One, and it's just been festering ever since. And so it went in remission, and now there's a new outbreak. And they need new bodies to justify the achievements of the apparatus of the despotic core. So there's no point in doing the operation of subversion outside totalitarian inside unless they can expand the totalitarian core with some fresh bodies to boss around. Because they atrophy everything else, the people stuck in their system to such a degree that it could be called exterminationism. Modern day slavery, I mean, you don't care about, people never cared about slaves. They don't care about their people that are politically neutered. They're not part of any type of decision-making process. They're here today, gone tomorrow, who cares, find another one. That's their way of thinking. It's not very long term. But again, it's so surprising that they would go so big with it. I think that's what most people just can't wrap their heads around. Naive Westerners just cannot come to terms with that these lunatics went that fast, that far, that early, that deep. And that, no, they didn't put it to rest. They didn't go in there through, they might have went through the archives, but they didn't go through the people and sort them out. This one was in on it, that one wasn't. They like to talk about World War II. They did that in Germany. Well, they didn't do it in Russia, not yet. They didn't do it in a lot of other countries that have been infected with new leftism. The branch is firmly attached to the Leninist tree. Merkel treat. But that situation can change. And looking at the Poles now and the Ukrainians now, they don't have any illusions about what the Russians, the despotic core, has to offer them. They know exactly what that life's going to be like. You think the same thing in Hungary, but look, they just took the top. They topped the top with some energy people. And so how far down do they go? Who knows? Are there free and fair elections there? Hard to say. Most likely not. But their penetration, they haven't gone that far, that they haven't spread out perhaps to the cultural scene yet, or maybe they have. Maybe it's just a matter of degrees. But of course, with the right eyewear, all of that could be analyzed, reviewed, and reconsidered based on realities on the ground. So, but yeah, some things are worth considering, other things aren't. Is this the right time to be alive? I'm sure most well-meaning, well-built, well-thinking people were not happy about World War I or World War II, or any other war for that matter, and yet they keep happening. So is it a state of perpetual war? Well, possibly. Certainly not in a state of resolution. We got a whole phony historical narrative that we were fed for 30 years. Oh, we won the Cold War, everybody. Yeah, just go to sleep. We're gonna we exchange softballs for tennis rackets and just ship all of our industrial base offshore. And we're gonna have this little machine shoot out digits at you. Or you're gonna watch Wall Street go up and down and consider yourself rich. Well, that's happening. Or you look into materialist values instead of the values they're looking into, which is rearmament, right? The military card, just roll in there, take over the stuff, whatever's left, and wherever you can do it, just do it. That is an old card. That card's been around since forever. Anybody can understand that card. Africans understand that card. But Westerners, you're Northern European, Southern European, what that? What's a military? What's a card? What game are they playing? They don't even know the rules. They're trying to figure out how they can, build a bigger rave and listen to goofy music and do goofy things because it's a goofy culture. So goofy that the goons think they can just roll in and just clear off the goofballs. So, just a light observation there on this wacky planet of ours. I guess I've been paying too much attention to the wrong things for too long to completely kick the habit, but I'm getting there. Compartmentalizing it. Like writing this stuff down, like 3 paragraphs, do, and then it's closed. Said what I wanted to say. Somebody could read it. They don't believe it. They can dispute it. Common values. Specifically to the challenges of the people at that time, the spiritual challenges. The Black Death was really bad, a lot worse than you can possibly imagine. You comfortable, self-satisfied modern person, postmodern person. Because I really wouldn't bring modernity in your together with what you represent, which is the opposite of modernity. So it's sort of like postmodern neo-barbaric. See, it's more neo-barbaric. Postmodernism is just sort of the overall category. Like after the moderns died out, this is sort of the zone we're in, where, for example, immorality is considered a superpower by cultural institutions that have been hijacked by outside geopolitical forces that aren't looking for your culture to continue or flourish, but rather discontinue and disappear. You don't think that's in their 50-year plan? If it isn't, they're certainly going to pen it in at some point, but maybe they've been at this for a long time. Global domination, it's not just a conspiracy, it's actually what's going on. It is organized effort to expand their franchise and shrink opposing ones. And it's biological in nature. It's shrinking life expectancies, shrinking life satisfaction to zero potentially. Whereas their lifespans get longer and they get richer instead. At least in material terms. Now, psychological or spiritual terms, that's a completely different field that they don't recognize. which they again thinks that gives them a superpower because they can just discard it, so they can just focus on the worldly expediencies without any of the what they believe funny stories about there being payback in an afterlife. They don't believe that. They've been told that was a trick and a lie to dupe people into not taking what they could otherwise take, to keep them stupid. The opium of the people, that's what how they see it. That's how they've been primed, that's how they've been conditioned, and that's how they can basically do anything with impunity, such as massive crimes against their so-called class enemies. Although again, do they even use the same old jargon? When it first started, they probably shifted it because they're all about deception. Repackaging things so that they sound more euphemistic so more people buy into it and thereby suit them in some way, such as dying out. You don't want buffalo uh, trampling over what you deem to be your plains that you've declared yours. There's very vulgar people that do very stupid things that don't care about dumb animals. They'll just open up some barrels of poison that smells like something they like, maybe poison salt licks, poison the water. You come back, you say, "Oh, hey, wait, I thought you had a problem with buffalo." The mandarin said, "No buffalo here. No explanation either." They're writing the history books that they lock up. Normal people, they don't get to read their history books, not of their old empires, until the empires are long gone. Most of the history books were kept as secret documents, and they only had eyes only for the emperor. What do you think? Any old worker or day wager or cotton mill owner or something could show up to the Forbidden City and say, "Hey, let me take a look into these books," although that wasn't the capital at the time. I'm thinking of specifically like the 8th century. The name escapes me at the moment, but it wasn't Beijing. And you definitely had different imperial palaces, and that led to warlordism. Wasn't always unified. So getting your values. So this is, if we come back to the attacks on the West as a whole, which is firstly a cultural attack. Just think of mushrooms. Mushrooms are growing in some place. How do you get rid of the mushrooms you don't want? Well, you mess up the soil microbiology or what have you. Same with culture. You mess up the culture, you mess up the products of the culture. And it doesn't require bullets, it just requires access and plausible deniability. And these smack talkers, they got a whole lot of both. A whole lot. "Oh no, I'm not. This is not an attack on your culture. This is the real culture. This is the way forward." This is the other thing. Culture does not stay static. Culture is a dynamic thing. So it can be getting more poisonous, toxic, and defective and crippled and crippling. Or it can be getting more dynamic. There's more opportunity. There's more commonality and unity. Let's say day by day, year by year. And it really is that unity that is necessary for people to generously produce to the point that others benefit from their overproduction. Why are they overproducing? Well, because that's a form of generosity. For example, if you're a master craftsman that produces eyewear, it is going to cost the person that has enough to compensate you to specifically devote yourself to that specialized field. But if you put in a lot of time to scale production to the point where even a school kid can get a pair of glasses, then you can see the dynamic between generosity, social generosity, and social beneficence and social flourishing. But for that to happen, you need to have the preconditions for people to overproduce, and that is a sense of gratitude that they have. So gratitude leads to generosity. You're paying forward. And that is a beneficial, well-managed, well-functioning society, which should be seen as an extension of a family, but not one overrun or ruled by principles that are contrary to social cohesion, unity, and good morals, good ethics, good virtues. So this is a thing that the Greek philosophers were talking about. That was sort of their whole concern, was developing the right ideas about life, but certainly helping in that way by explaining those principles, to spreading those principles, so that everyone would benefit from their insights. And yet you can see that's a somewhat materialistic way to convey wisdom. Whereas the other way, practicing religion, means that everyone is responsible for their own wisdom, but the wisdom regarding how to get wisdom in the form of good practice is something that one can and should share and explain, so that the most possible people can benefit by producing wisdom within themselves, being grateful for that, and then sharing that to perhaps unimaginable degree. Wisdom spreads, right? Just like stupidity can spread, wisdom can spread. It's a completely different change. It's like a dry landscape. It's just burning up in the sun versus, let's say, 2 weeks of nourishing rain. And then you come back to the same landscape. It is the same landscape. It's a completely different level of health based on having an overabundance of the key component of flourishing societies, which is wisdom, versus compared to another society that has a lack of wisdom, lack of rain. So imagine if that drought continues. Most people would say, oh, this drought can't continue. But if it's a man-made drought, if the water that they've diverted from the mountains is saline, has a salinity content, which is impossible to really detect by taste or sight, but over the course of hundreds of years will salt the fields. Those are irrevocable mistakes that have inevitable results, and a lack of wisdom. You have a lack of wisdom, it might not come back. Your society might be doomed. Your culture, your landsmen and women and children and everything else are gone. They get subsumed as slaves into a more dominant and brutish organizations if they're not capable of fleeing or defending themselves. And so you can see this on the fringes of the Western world, especially over time. Go back into the history books, learn about the interesting history, not about the politicized history. Go back 200 years, these complete maniacs lose their interest as far as lying about what was. Because that is one of their commonest of tricks, is to misinterpret the past. Because who can dispute them? I know if you try to dispute them, then they just ration up the irrationality to the point of violence. So how far will you go? Well, they'll escatory ladder you up to a violent deed. Will you do that? Well, most likely not. So they win their argument in the public forum, where security is not working to eject such people who are quite easy to identify amongst philosophers, right? The forum had its decorum. Everyone could potentially, well, let's not say everyone, just citizens had legal access to the forum if it was a public forum for the public of that country, understandably. Then you had to understand and speak the language at a time when languages and knowledge of language was not very common unless you had a very good reason for it, and most people didn't. So then you have the language, which means you have a lot of commonality. Also genetic commonality. There are no problems on those most basic of levels. We're already talking about 3 levels. So, but then there were also behavioral decorums. If you got access to a forum and played the fool, you would be ejected and possibly physically injured, so that you realize that if you did it again, it could be death. Actually, some people were killed, I believe. Some of them for, let's say, not very clear reasons or clearly reasoned reasons. It didn't work all the time, but there were, let's just say, extreme consequences for bad behavior. So on the other hand, so that led to a general respect of the venue, which of course was run by the top minds of their cultures, and they were not being run by imposters or outsiders or ideologues. So how did that happen? Well, there in our time, well, you have to go back to World War II, I guess, don't you? And the negative downstream cultural side effects of that, where the banking class decided not to trust populists or demagogues, when in fact that's a pretty despotic conclusion to make, especially for people that could profit the most by that delusion, shall we say. And so we've had, if you want to talk about real decline, starting, you want to say 1950. If you want to go back beyond that, you go to the Great Depression. Beyond that, World War I. So, but on the other hand, you can think of it as a dynamic process where bad things happen and flourish, but perhaps also good things. So it's a mixed bag. It's like yin and yang all the time. It just doesn't. It's a dynamic process. It's not stationary. So Athens of today is not the Athens of yesteryear. And yet the Athens of today claims to be a democracy, as the people did back in the 5th or 4th century BC. Then you also had kings that came in, and so democracy was shelved for a few years. It wasn't just the only way of governing. And in any case, when you get into politics, you get into people's interest, greedy interest. And also the ill will interest. Let me smash up these other people because I don't want them threatening my border. Like that type of mentality goes way back. Spoiling maneuvers. Also, how about this perspective? These people, they're different than us. Just they have totally different values. They're ominous. And they're pretty much useless to us because we can't go to their areas and feel safe. And they're not coming into ours because we wouldn't feel safe if they were here. Now you can have a bunch of sociologists attempt and fail to disable those types of instincts, or you can work with them and just say, all right, let's make this system, these people, separate. And thereby we don't have any of these mind-numbing conflicts about some type of disparity on these basic levels that the philosophers did not of their day, of the ancient times, did not have to deal with. Forcing together people that have nothing in common, not even the most basic things, and then causing this, declaring this anti-culture as the culture, while people are just run financially into the ground by a bunch of rapacious space cadets. So it's interesting to fly over history and also to leave it behind. Like if you're just flying over it and you're not attached to it. And if you apply good words to it, and that's something that's very important. If you've felt some type of insult during this lecture, then that is your dukkha. It was not intended from my side at all. See, but you have to see how the subnormal person personalizes insults that they perceive, but misperceive them to be such because they're delusional too. So it's usually a two-step process. So including subnormal people in supernormal exercises such as researching, discovering, and reestablishing common values and principles and social cohesion is well beyond them. Certainly well beyond even the normal person. So no, not everyone should be invited to the conversation. A lot of people should be ejected for their wildly immoral ways that they want to redefine into some type of modernity, when in fact it's barbarism, people, barbarism. Barbarism as an astroturf campaign in a context of disinformation and geopolitics. That's sort of what it is. Don't put any extras on it. You personalize these types of antisocial models in yourself. To the extent you do that, you're defective. You're repellent, and you're retrograde. So no, anyone who feels like they deserve to be included in the conversation probably doesn't belong in the conversation. Because why? They don't have virtue. And virtue is, again, step number one. Then comes samadhi, which is a lot of work, by the way. It takes a lot of patience. Well, not work. It takes patience. It's a lot of patience. A lot of people don't have that, especially not today. And the third part is wisdom. That is the absolute end. That is the top of the tree. Most people don't get there. So no, you don't deserve to be at the top of the tree just because you got two legs and a butt. Let me tell you, most subnormals these times have the butt on their mind all the time. Male and female butts that just got butts on the mind. Rally for butts. It's to think that this has happened. That it is now that modern technology has recorded this behavior. It is just infamy. Absolute infamy. But there we go. Humanity has an infamous side, apparently. And there's infamous actors involved here. Putting big bucks behind big butts. I mean, it's... Even in the Buddhist time, we're talking 500 BC, this wasn't going on. Not this version of it. Hell no. Hell no, it wasn't. So, but the modern Padujanas of today, they really think they're super advanced. It's quite comical, the disparity between what they think and what the factuality of the situation is. So, never end in tears, but do be clear-eyed and see that there is a way that does work, and it's a lot simpler, and it requires a lot less middlemen, including getting the financial system under control. The bank, or should I say banks, all that can be nationalized. All financial transactions goes into one system. Everybody has a bank account, and the system regulates it, and there's no people profiting off of it. And there's no illegal transactions between countries. China does not get a stake in the West, period. And neither do other cronies. And that means no trade either until their policies change. And they take let's say, a more domestic focus in a humane and civilized way. And focusing on the environment and sustainable models, and not aggression across all fields. Strangling the goose that laid the golden eggs. Because if they don't come to their right minds, and they very well might, would it be a tragedy if one day the world woke up and they were no longer there because perhaps there was a volcano that took them out? So, but it all just depends, right? That we're in a dynamic situation. The world history can change. The Asian steppes, once a flourishing, beautiful, magnificent part of the world, got destroyed by a bunch of animal herders, akin to the Indians, more or less, that decided to use their cavalry and their superior bowmanship and way of fighting and organizing to just roll over the civilized people from the Altai Mountains to Anatolia. And the results of that catastrophe being with us to this day. So there's a lot of people sitting on real estate that has just been more or less granted to them out of sheer negligence, incompetence, or there's bad luck. And quite unexpectedly so. Nobody thought that a bunch of goat herders would get together and take over half the world. But they did. So these things can happen. People back then, they were really surprised. And what's happening today, really surprising. But there can also be reversals that are really surprising too. So we'll just have to see what happens. How about this? The Persians, when they took over Babylonia, or Babylon, they released the Jews that were held in captivity, and they went back and built the second temple. So how about that? They didn't put the Jews to the stake. They didn't burn them. And in fact, a lot of the theology of the Zoroastrianism flowed into the Second Temple theological understanding. So there was a more dynamic time before things got dogmatized between people, learning from each other and also treating each other with compassion. Saying, look, yeah, apparently being enslaved ain't the best thing, so here's your freedom. Make what you will of it. But certainly don't become a bunch of slave drivers like the other barbarians. You would think that someone who was so generously bestowed with their freedom would then return that generosity throughout time, should they still exist. And yet we see it's sometimes a mixed bag, right? So that's just one influence. There's a lot of other influences. There's the Byzantine influence. So would have Rome, the Roman Empire, continue to exist without Christianity? Was it a crisis in values which more or less undermined an emperor cult? Possibly. You don't want to pay taxes. Even though it says give unto Caesar, nobody wants to pay taxes to Caesar. That's like that's the part where people leave Jesus behind. Like, what? You're too good, man. I'm not that good. And so they had diminishing revenues. Whereas, again, think of the difference. If you think you're literally sending money to a god on earth, you would really feel pretty bad about yourself if you didn't send the right amount. Maybe you would send even more to have more glory by being more recognized by an earthly god. So the difference is quite striking, especially because Julius Caesar comes across as a complete boob in the New Testament. I don't think a lot of people that did understand and like Jesus thought he was the smartest guy in the Bible. And so just imagine that Jesus is saying pay your taxes to Caesar, but the people reading the book might have looked at that somewhat ironically, given the incompetence of Julius Caesar to be a just judge of a just man. So that had to have had a tremendously debilitating effect on the credibility of the empire. Tremendous. And so then you can also understand why the Romans threw them to the lions. Like, these people just have no respect. Disrespecting an earthly god, that's just big no-no. And yet the people, the cynical Christians, were like, look, what do you think? He's a god? Come on, look at him. His tunic's crooked, he's half drunk, he's half in the bag. Here's some sketches on our slate with some chalk of the orgies he's throwing in the fountains he's built. This guy, here he is passed out. Here's a slate of him passed out, butt naked. Oh, here's the report of the doctor he has that had to remove something from somewhere. So this guy isn't a god. He's just he's a boob. Oh, how about this? He's irreligious. He's amoral. Oh yeah, and throwing people like us that are cynical about this whole thing to our terrible deaths in front of spectators, that's not all that good, is it? How do you spell good? G-O-O-D or O-D-D? That's odd that these people would throw other people to lions and think of themselves as superior beings. So, what you believe in your religion, the religion does matter. It's either a cohesive force or it's a corrosive force. And on the other hand, was the corrosivity of Christianity necessarily a bad thing? Given that having emperors and emperor worship has and can lead to innumerous follies that end in total disaster, and also subjugate a lot of people that not only do they have no business subjugating, but don't want to be subjugated in the first place, which prompts some type of warlike fighting that leads to innumerable deaths and injuries, dispossessions, burning downs, taking, stealing, harming, disrupting. And yet, on the other hand, sometimes disruption is good. Like everybody, oh, we got this place on lock. My great-great-grandfather took control of this area from this mountain to that mountain. So this is mine. Nobody can come here unless they have that permission from me or pay me something. You think that's a great business model, being a landlord? I don't know. Seems like you could have a lot of aggravation, especially if people who are disposed by other warring factions show up the next day and you feel compelled to organize them in some way via a protection racket. You pay me and I'll protect you. And then to think of the obligations of that as well, especially if you're in a somewhat desirable, populated neighborhood. You can't even imagine doing that with a group of primates, let alone people. So it's really, really odd that we have all of these positions we think are so enviable and so powerful and so enriching, and yet looking at their day-to-day, it's probably not worth it. Certainly not in terms of aggravation, especially if you do put a premium on your peace of mind, as you should as a spiritual being that is on a spiritual journey, that is spiritually evolving instead of devolving. If you see it that way, if you see it in terms of karma, well, you can get on a completely different trajectory that has a lot less aggravation built into the plan from the beginning. So what other Padujanos or outsiders think of that, it really doesn't matter. In fact, if they call you an idiot for doing that, it really doesn't mean much if they're idiots, does it? Like, it doesn't mean a lot, does it? But of course, idiot, this is a word. Is it a good word or a bad word? It's probably not the word one should use. Well, let's say misguided. Why not? Were we all not misguided at some point? Let's not use sharp words to criticize others, because it comes back like a boomerang and hits us in the face. We'll call ourselves idiots. Well, if we're an idiot, then we're incapable of learning, but that's not true. And neither are these idiots, but it might not be their karma to escape from samskaras because they're in knee deep. They don't have one precept that they honor per day. So how much progress do you think they're going to make in this life versus the potential downsides that they might unexpectedly encounter by not following the five precepts? How about, like, number one, not killing? Whoa, how about a guy that's just loose on that principle? How far do you think he's going to make it in life? Let me tell you, the odds are sort of against success. certainly in the spiritual realm, because these things come back to you. Like you can't shake some things unless you put in a lot of work, unless you are the super skillful, and unless you're squeaky clean going forward, because each case is going to have its own baggage associated with it. So you want to talk about being an excellent practitioner? Well, how about not putting things on your plate that require an expert practitioner to absolve yourself from? Absolve you, absolve yourself, and absolve any of these foolish deeds that can result by not following the precepts. Not following the precepts means you're just, dancing a little bit on the edge of a cliff. If there's a wind, the fun you have dancing is really going to be overshadowed by what happens when you fall over the cliff. Because, you just slipped with your left leg, hit a pebble, and it's down the cliff you go. Now, will you break your neck quick? Or maybe halfway down, you just sort of land on a ledge with a broken back, and maybe it'll take 5 days, or maybe you don't even have a scratch, but you have to get from that point A to point B, and it's not really clear at that point. So you made life a lot more difficult to yourself, and you almost lost your life, you could say that. But you can reclaim it, but it's going to take some special skills, because you're already out of the normal bounds. There's really no advice somebody can give you other than you need to figure it out for yourself in samadhi. But to do that, you need to have virtue, which means you need to have the precepts. So it really is that simple, step by step. So this has been a rather wide-ranging dialogue about many things. One of them being, the concept of the devil that came into the Old Testament via the Persians, the Achaemenid, because there was a theological exchange between the ex-slaves and the Persian theologians that discussed things with each other, and one side took some of that with them. It did change their point of view, their way of thinking. There was adaptation. It wasn't just these people teaching everyone else what is right, but people being open to different insights. So the idea of the trickster, that's also something that comes from, you can look into Nordic lore as well. Who is it that's the trickster? And if you go to Faust, you can see that sort of as well. But let's not forget, these tricks could lead to the end of your life. They could lead to the destruction of your soul, right? Going through time into the future lives, to the hell realm. So yes. So there are consequences to those tricks. So you want to think of it as a joke and a trick if you get through them. If you don't, if you fall into the traps of the sense realm, it's not really funny, is it? It means a lot of suffering. So I think it's a nice way of putting it. Other people would say a deceiver, like the hungry ghost. If you talk to them, that's what they'll say. He deceived me. My eyes deceived me. My cravings deceived me. So you can walk down a forest path, and then if you turn around, that's how it happened. I saw the hungry ghost, and that's what he said. So these jokes, they're not funny unless you can laugh. And you can laugh when you put them behind you. And so put behind you greed, ill will, and delusion.